questions or more?
The Holocaust thing was just this week?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry.
It's gone now.
Yeah,
So
I saw that, I was just looking.
yeah, he took everything down. I think there was a lot of press coverage of it, so if you're interested in a lot of the other images that are out there, they're probably still covered in.
I came across a couple of those. It's kind of interesting, actually. I think I like the idea, not even as a public shaming, but it really, like, the image of those people in those situations really just, like, makes you look at those pictures again.
Yep.
And it makes you look at them in a different way, especially in comparison to the Holocaust Memorial and the side-by-side pictures. I think it's actually just a really great way to push out that imagery again, to remind people. I like that aspect of it.
Yeah.
Even, I actually don't think it's all that big of a deal. I mean, the guys with their little tagline of jumping on Jews, I mean, obviously it's really, really offensive, but, you know, as you said, the artist himself wanted that kind of an experience where, you know, healing, I think I like that as well.
It's interesting too because if you visited the website a week ago, there's no warning for any of it. It just says Holocaust. You're like, oh, what a title to choose. And then there's a bunch of selfies, and you're like, weird. And just by scrolling down, your cursor happens to kind of graze over them, and that's how they're spliced together. So there's no warning that there's upsetting imagery, strong imagery, any violent imagery, anything like that. And it's kind of like, oh my goodness. And I was looking at it on my phone, so you can just touch with your finger, and it was, yeah. My partner wasn't happy with me because we were out to dinner, and I was like, people keep sending me this link, and it's, okay, we're not gonna. But yeah, so it's interesting because I mean, that shock value is obviously very important to the way in which he wanted the project to play out. And I think it played out pretty successfully. He got 12 people to take their offensive selfies down off of the internet. But that also calls into question the ways in which people police each other online in a way that they might not necessarily do in person. Yeah.
Mine follows up on that. This image here, I'm just curious, I'm sure lots of people have taken a similar picture. How does this one end up, so it's like in Huffington News or wherever, like how did this particular one get picked up? And
so if you'll notice on the bottom here, I think it says there's 4,000 retweets. So that's fairly popular for a random everyday person who's not famous or a politician or anything, other than a 16-year-old young lady. So the popularity of those retweets, the way Twitter's algorithms work, it boosts it to the top of a lot of people's feeds, and the more people retweet, it kind of builds this network.
how did it first get picked up? I mean, because she's just a teenage girl, so why would it have been initially picked up? Like Justin Bieber went and said something stupid at the Anne Frank Memorial. He's Justin Bieber, he says something dumb, everyone knows about it, but why would you know?
I published an article on Elizabeth the movie and tweeted that I published it. It went to my 200 followers or 400 followers. It was picked up, somebody retweeted it and put hashtag Kapoor, who's the Indian director of the film. His hashtag picked it up, it went to 24 million people.
But she's...
So one person.
Right, is that what happened?
It just needs one person and then
So she somehow, somebody saw it and...
Yeah.
So one of her followers or multiples of her followers.
Because I'm guessing it started out because the thing about retweets and likes is that I've had people ask us, Jen and I, this a lot. They're like, oh, but like I don't want to like a Holocaust photo because I don't like it. But the like kind of has a cultural meaning beyond the like standard notion of I like this photo. So basically, in her tiny network, people probably retweeted it because they knew about her history with her dad. And then somebody who follows them saw it and they retweeted it, and then outrage was sparked because people thought it was offensive. And then the more angry people got, the more and more they retweeted it, and it just kind of, so the Huffington Post.
This speaks to your point about hashtags, right? Because
Yeah.
you just need to hashtag Holocaust. One of her followers, just one single follower, needs to do a hashtag
And then it's
Holocaust.
in the...
So I wanted to ask you about hashtags and how your book is addressing hashtags, because that seems to be a really sneaky. I'm coming to this, and I'm not asking you to do that. You're doing enough theoretical work, rich theoretical work already. But coming at it from performance studies theory, this all speaks to Checkner's notion of twice performed behavior, and I'm thinking of the Schindler's List, the repetition of that imaging is just exactly what we talk about in theatre all the time, or in performance, street art or whatever, street performances or whatever. But hashtag is a sort of retweeting, and hashtagging is a sort of twice performed behavior, right? And I wondered how you're placing your work within, what are you doing with hashtags?
What do you think?
What do I think?
Okay, Kim, for the diverse ages represented here, can you first explain how hashtag works?
So yeah, a hashtag is basically, it's used primarily, I like to think, as a grouping phrase, and if you use them on Twitter or Instagram or Tumblr, what they do, the algorithms on these sites, they collate all that information, so anything that's kind of tagged or organized with that tag, you can then look at all under one feed. So it's handy because if you want to look up, like I'm going to, at the end of today, all of the photos that were taken on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, you can just go to that hashtag and it'll all kind of come up. You have to use the hashtag though, and if you don't, there's other questions about like what doesn't get included if they don't use the hashtag.
And what's a normal hashtag? Like, is that the little boxy thing?
Yeah,
And then it's something?
Yeah, it's the,
Okay,
yeah,
so
so like
someone
the pound
makes it
sign
and then
yeah.
everyone uses it?
Yeah, yeah.
Got it, thank you,
Yeah,
sorry.
so it's a good way to organize information.
Cross-referencing.
Yeah, like a
Basically.
category, you know, like a
And you can
category.
do something completely random like hashtag Megan Mondrigan's talk, right? Like, which I might be the only person that uses it, but I can do that and then it'll link up to her.
And they can be used to like kind of organize your own information as well as contribute to a larger conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Hashtags.
As performance. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's tricky. And the other thing that makes it even trickier is that while we use hashtags across platforms, they function differently, right? So as you know, because the tweets that you have are linked to your Facebook page, I know far too much about David. But so when David tweets, it generates on his Facebook account. And yet when you search by hashtag on Facebook, because Facebook isn't really set up to search through hashtag, it doesn't do the same thing. So you wouldn't capture the richness of sources that way.
No.
So to speak about how hashtags work, you even have to go that nitty-gritty just to sort of outline that it does things differently on different platforms. Similarly, if you wanted to look, like Megan does work, we all divided the book according to platform. So the book is actually, which we had to argue for, a lot actually, but each chapter is a different platform because we're trying to make the argument that the platforms matter and how they shape the conversation. And that to argue thematically, which is nice and would work well, takes away an emphasis on the fact that this is a digital thing that has its own logic. So, you know, hashtags work differently in Tumblr than they do on Twitter, as an example. And you can't just put in a hashtag on Tumblr and expect that you're going to get the same kinds of things that you would maybe see on Twitter. So it's complicated on that level as well, beyond just even thinking about it conceptually, right? So, and I think a big part of our book is about spelling all of that out and making it very crystal clear so that somebody who comes in and is like, I don't know what a hashtag is, that it's meant to be a bit of a guidebook for sort of how do we deal with these sources. And I think the first thing that we are trying to emphasize is to take seriously the complexity. Because with technology and with these images, I think we get a certain complacency that you know, it's fast. Either it's fast moving and it's always changing. It's too difficult, so we don't want to think about it, or it's ubiquitous and we don't consider the nitty gritty. And so our book is meant to really spell out some of these things in a very, very sort of user-friendly way to make it less transparent, really, and more fun. So.
I'm writing, I'll plug another project I'm doing right now. I'm writing a chapter for a Wiley Blackwell companion on Holocaust history on social media. And I've decided to use the hashtag as kind of my focal point because it's supposed to be kind of overarching and I could talk forever about YouTube or Instagram or whatever. And I think, I've like only started outlining it, but I think the way I'm going to kind of divide it up is as being kind of a self-referential archival term, but also like a conversational term.
Right.
That people can use it to communicate to one another, but it also contributes to like a large kind of crowdsourced archive that shifts and changes. But that's my very basic outline so far.
Yeah, I just want to ask, do you think, Megan, that Brianna's photo would not have been hated so much if she made it a bit more personal in the description? Like, I love you, Dad, I made it to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Hashtag RIP.
Yeah, I think 100%, 110% even. I think if she chose to kind of code it differently also, she, talking about her own personal history. One of the issues with Twitter though is there's not a lot of space. But I guess she could have very easily put, I miss you, Dad, hashtag RIP. I think that if more of that was present right at the forefront, it wouldn't have been, I think there still would have been a lot of people that were very upset, also because of her age and because of her gender. The internet isn't a nice place for young ladies. But I think that kind of, you've highlighted one of the complications that Jen and I run into all the time, Hollis, is that she knows what the meaning of her photograph is, and even though that's not clear to all of us at the outset, we have to kind of work in that gray area between the personal and the public, and it can be really tricky. But yeah, I think if she tweeted something different, it probably wouldn't have been as much outrage.
Twitter is known for outrage, just in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Explosive.
Yeah, Dominique?
I've got two things to say. One of them is that there is the newness of it, which Jennifer says you're trying to tackle by pitching your book as a guide. But the newness of it is also about how the users learn the ethics of that new kind of communication. And so you said earlier education, and I'm asking about morality and ethics. So there's a whole code of ethics about writing for history or about writing an article for newspaper. And then there's the whole, wild world of, because it's so rapid, of the ethics of, there's the individual thing, but there's also the professional use of these platforms. And so I just would like to hear you a little about your education bit and your take on how fast the medium is going and how the codes of ethics of the use of that media are developing. But the other thing is that part of what you're saying about the kind of appropriateness of these images and these moments, I can, and you know that, I can point at so many times anything social media where charitable campaigns and, Live Aid being the one, where there's a kind of hubris around the suffering of others. And and people struggle with that, and even recently, and that's a social media one, Pius Adesanya in African Studies, he was looking on his phone at all these American parties on the Ebola crisis, and the beer drinking and the fun of raising funds for Ebola. And he said that his mates in Nigeria thought that was highly offensive, right? And this is a bit like your lot, but with the past. So there is a pre-social media trouble, which I recognize. So in a way, what you're doing there, it's helping me make sense of things that haven't even got social media in it, right? A bit like your social shaming guy who took an old thing and said, okay, now on. But anyway.
Can I just speak to one little thing, and then you can pick up on ethics, the harder question. Always be the first one. This is the thing. There is a really interesting history, of course, to how, I don't want to call it shaming, but there is a history to what images enter into the public sphere, and how there is a value judgment that's being made. And the greatest example would be the U.S. Army Signal Corps liberation of Dachau by African American soldiers. But we couldn't actually, the American public couldn't countenance, and I use that in a very broad way, the thought that African American soldiers were liberating the camp. And so these initial images that we all think of had to be retaken to satisfy the taste of the day. And so there is a certain process of selectivity, right, that goes into what images enter into the public sphere and why. And I guess our point is to try to not just make that explicit, but also sort of historicize it. Like, social media didn't invent the the fact that images are tricky, and that there is a certain public face to what can be displayed. But it's about sort of showing what the stakes are in today's world versus the 1940s, let's say. So there's that, and there embedded in that is a question of ethics and periodizing taste, decorum, shame, whatever. Basically saying that these are cultural documents, right, and that they need to be thought of in that way.
Yeah, I think too. So your point about images being tricky is really important, because I was wondering if I was going to get to bring up this anecdote. I spent half of July at the Jewish Museum in Berlin looking through guest books, hundreds of guest books since the museum opened on the 12th of September in 2001, and now I have this unfortunate file, well, not unfortunate, intriguing file in my Google Photos account that's just hundreds of pictures of phalluses that people have drawn in the guest book. So this question of appropriate behavior was also not, created by Instagram. People were visually trying to represent their irreverence or their sassiness or their grade school boy brains or something in the guest books even before they could take offensive selfies at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I don't really know if that's ever going to factor into my dissertation, but now I've got all these photos of them, so that's great for Google's algorithm. On the question of ethics is a really tricky one too, because I see it personally as being tied into a similar discussion about the ethics of using traditional archives for historical research, because those archives are also the lives and stories of people who have experienced trauma or joy or sadness, all of the different kind of breadth of human emotion. And if it seems like kind of a cop-out answer, but if we think about Instagram and Twitter as a different archive, we can apply that kind of same ethical parameter. The tricky thing is with social media is most of these people are still alive and walking around out in the world, living their lives, whether or not they've been publicly shamed on Twitter or not. And this is something I'm going to have to think about for my own work as well, because I focus a lot on the Tower of Faces at the US Holocaust Museum and what it means for people to take photos in that space where they're kind of appropriating the faces of victims who are just very clearly within view, and that those faces circulate on social media as well. And it's tricky because every platform has a different terms and conditions contract. It's got a different ethical framework. So once you put a photo up on Instagram, it's now property of Facebook. It's not your photo anymore. So it's not necessarily in a legal sense unethical of Shapira to take these images from social media because they are there for public consumption. But I do wonder about using them for his particular ends.
I was asking more, that's great what you're saying, I was asking also or more about the self-regulation, how people that, how the ethics of it might also come up from the ground up through learning. I'm just asking if you're watching something like that.
Can I just, the images of Jill, just to bring Jill back into, I think are really useful in that respect, right? That this 12-year-old, now 12, she was 11 at the time, somehow something about the way that the kids today learn to appreciate the Holocaust made her first reaction to those spaces, take on that particular shape. And one could make the argument that these 20-year-olds are reacting against that, right? That they're bulking that in the way that they're disrespecting the space. But so where does that self-regulation come from? Yes, it comes from me and having talked forever about these spaces and the Holocaust, and so on one hand, Jill is embodying that. And on the other, it's from the visual world that she encounters, right? And this is where the Schindler's List imagery is so interesting. Like, why are people constantly sort of using filters and using Erica, to give Erica a shout out, the way that when she does some of her research, she finds that the violin solo from Schindler's List is used in YouTube all the time by people when they decide to make their own tourist videos. So you're right, like self-regulation as a cultural process product is really interesting, where people are getting these ideas about how to behave in that particular space. And I think that's where this idea of education is fascinating, and where we play a role, because they are going to Yad Vashem and to the Holocaust Museum and to the Auschwitz Memorial to get these images.
Yeah.
They are going to these places and finding them and then putting them in their own feed along with their own selfie. So to turn our backs on it, I think really neglects the very real possibility of shaping how they are appreciating these spaces. And then also recognizing that, you know, they are at some point in time 22 on a trip to Germany, and they're
Probably a little.
they're behaving a certain way. And a great parallel would be, I saw an exhibit, it's not a Holocaust story, it's a genocide story, great. But I was at I think it was the ROM or the Art Gallery of Ontario, one of the two had the exhibition on the documents from Cambodia, the photographs from Cambodia before these people were murdered. Now the photos were taken moments before they were ushered off and shot. So there's a ubiquitous photo of a young girl, she's like 9. She was the first photo in the exhibition. The moment you came up the elevator, you could go to the fashion exhibit or you could go to the genocide exhibit. So if you chose to turn right, you'd see this young girl's face, she's 9. And I was up there and I was looking at them, each one, and I saw a group of 4 boys come up. They were like 11 or 12. They came up the elevator and they clearly were up to no good. And they came off and they were loud and it was a very quiet space. They exited the elevator, they ran around a little bit, and one of them walked up to this photo and it's blown up really huge. And he stood this far away from her face and he kissed her. And my first reaction was, oh my God, what is that? That is inappropriate. And then I realized he's 11. And to be 11 is to be sometimes a bit of a shit disturber. And so there is something to be said for the fact that this is life, and this is life in all of its guises, and it's what it means to be human. You don't have to like it, but it is very real, right? So we have to think about it. I think we have to think about that.
We've had intense discussions in various conferences of public history about monuments in exactly that way, which is so the whole, I think what you were saying, the site specificity is really important. So what happened on that site where the Holocaust Memorial is? What was there? If it had been a concentration camp or a prison or a Gestapo operation or something like that, then people would have a different attitude towards what could happen. But every time I've been there, there's been people partying, there's been picnics, there's been family, there's been buses, there's been all sorts. And in some ways, it's about appropriating that space, right? In the same way you appropriate a monument. And I'm not talking really about urinating on the war memorial, but there are other things that have happened at the war memorial that people in Ottawa regard as disrespectful. But it might be picnicking, it might be having your clementine on it. And I've seen a veteran criticize someone for having their clementine at the war memorial. And really what that person is saying is, this is my space, this is my quiet time. And you can argue about the ethics of that, but it's also about appropriation, and it's not about learning and unlearning behavior. It's actually an act of saying, this is my space and I'm going to use it in my own way. And the last conference I was at, we had a huge argument over tagging on monuments. And what does that mean? And should the National Council of Public History issue a public declaration that tagging is evil and wrong and is destroying monuments, or is tagging about 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 28-year-olds appropriating a public space and actually creating a counter-narrative, because you have to read the tags, right? You have to understand what the tags are about before you can really... And
the ultimate end product of that, and this is where your comment about the photos, like them or leave them, they create something new. And that something new is historical consciousness, right? I mean, it's when these two things rub up against each other that there is this sense of something's not quite right, this maybe shouldn't be happening, how do I feel about this? And what does that do? That perpetuates the memory of, in this case, the Holocaust, right? It makes it alive, and it in a sense, I mean, it's serving the purpose of memory, and it's why Eisenman says that this is why we shouldn't regulate what happens in this space, because we want it to.
They're clementines.
Right, so that if you feel, if that's weird, then you have to think about, well, why is this weird? Why is this strange? Why is this perhaps not something I like? And so there it's alive again, the memory, right?
I think the site specificity too that comes with, so the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is an interesting case as versus like USHM or Yad Vashem. Because if you go to USHM or Yad Vashem, you're there and the narrative and the story and the history you're supposed to be learning is like embedded in structure, and you walk through it and you experience it. You can very easily not really know anything about the Holocaust or the memorial and stumble across it because you're in Berlin, and if you don't read German, you don't know, you might know what Juden means, but like other than that, and there's all these people like on these stones, and it's a very interesting space. It's got great light. It's very incredible in that way. And the museum is underneath it, so you have to make an active choice to kind of go down and know where the museum is, know where the entrance is. So it's a little more ambiguous too, in that regard, which kind of, I think, yeah, makes it more fraught for a lot of people. That's why you tend to see more people being upset about the Holocaust Memorial than taking selfies at USHM.
Have you seen the, I don't know if you can see it from here, but the Russian monument that's being defaced?
No.
I'm not sure where, Bulgaria, in Bulgaria, with all the superheroes on the soldiers. So
Oh,
they
yes,
painted it
where they
over.
painted, yes, there's.
Yeah, so I mean, that, like,
Yeah,
that's
right.
that's a whole nother,
Yeah,
like,
suddenly Spider-Man on there.
yeah, I mean, that just,
Yeah.
I mean, if I was Russian, I'd probably be very offended, but, I mean, it certainly speaks to the way that people, like, see those monuments, and so, you know, that's kind of, like, when you're tagging something, I mean, I think in this case, it's probably rather negative, but,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. No, it creates a whole different narrative, right, for,
Yeah.
yeah.
for Bulgaria.
It's for
Now a Bulgarian monument.
Bulgarian
Yeah.
monument. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
exactly, it's
yeah.
turned it into a Bulgarian monument, yeah. Appropriating American superheroes, I mean, it's just, the layer is really, quite, yeah. And this is what Checkner argues, right, is that the choice for form behavior leads to a theory and leads to exactly what you captured, so you don't need that at all.
So that's something we'll want to look
But it's
into for
really
sure
interesting.
then, that's really useful.
Yeah. Thanks, Graham. That's good.
Well, thanks
Awesome.
for
Thanks
coming
for
out.
coming, asking questions.
Bringing the questions.
Now I've got to write to Serge and say, redo your social media paper for my book, and I can't